Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and today what we're going to be doing is talking about a bunch of games that you can see in front of us. This is not a pickups video. This is, and I know what I titled this, and we'll get to, the details of these games later, but really this is a video aimed specifically at people from the United States and from Canada. Not that people from other regions aren't welcome to watch. In fact, I would be very curious to see what people in Europe and in Australia think of this particular video. But the question I pose to a lot of you is, why don't people in North America have a tendency to import European games? And it's kind of generic, but why is that? Now, let me elaborate here. For years, I have been talking about my collecting habits, and I've made mention of the fact multiple times that I pick stuff up from Europe. The way I do it is if I'm into a console, I'll buy stuff from my own region. Herp derp, that makes sense. But after that, I will typically be like, okay, so after my region, what came out in Europe that we never got? And I'll focus on that. And then after that, I focus on what came out in Japan that we never got. Now, if you're into retro video games, well, thanks, you're probably watching the video for that reason alone, otherwise I don't know what you're doing here. But if you're into that, you probably also have some sort of collection of video games. And if you're in the US or Canada, you probably focus primarily on the stuff released there. That makes perfect sense. But I'm also willing to bet that a lot of you have made the decision of like, well, I also want to import stuff from Japan. And everybody will inevitably have like a couple of Japanese games here and there for whatever reason. In fact, you'll occasionally see things like Hong Kong releases, which of course is not part of Japan, but you'll still see them. Yet, almost nobody has PAL imports here. And, I mean, dude, I'm telling you, I've traveled around to a lot of different conventions, and often in the US and Canada, again, it'll be like tables and tables of people selling stuff, mostly from that region. That completely makes sense. But there's always a couple of people who have Japanese sections, and it's just all like Famicoms and Super Famicoms and all that sort of stuff. But never, not even one time at a convention in the US or Canada, have I ever found a seller who's selling PAL stuff. And I just can't figure out entirely why that is. So I went around asking a bunch of my friends in the scene. I've asked people this at conventions. I've alluded to this in videos over the years. Like, I wanted to talk about it. And I have only come to the consensus that there's just varying opinions, and most of them just seem to boil down to a couple of factors, and I wanted to address those factors. Now, the first one that I'm almost universally told, I think is just factually wrong, but it's almost always the first thing I hear people say. Oh, region lockout. Okay, that can be true, but in a lot of instances, it's not. Now, we'll go through that when we get to some of these games. Now, there are some games, yes, they have region lockout, but they're easily bypassed. Or in some cases, there just is no region coding of any kind. And also, to be honest with you, a lot of the time I hear anybody make that argument, for some reason, Japanese stuff doesn't apply. Then they're fine with getting past region coding. Like, I'm not even joking. I've had this discussion with people where they're like, yeah, I like stuff from the US and I'll buy stuff from Japan, but I don't get European stuff because of like region lockouts. I'm like, why would the Japanese stuff, like, what? It's that argument doesn't usually hold water. There are some instances where it does, but most of the time it doesn't. The second one I've also heard come up a bunch of times is another one of them that's like one of these things where you kind of vaguely hear it, so you just assume it's always true, but in reality it's not. And that has to do with specifically the PAL format of, or at least the video frequency of 50 hertz versus 60 hertz. Now, at the time, for most of the retro gaming era, if you want to horribly call it that, you can say that most stuff in the US was coming out at 60 hertz, aka 60 frames per second, and in Europe it was functioning at 50 frames per second, aka it was slower. And so people bring that over and be like, I don't want a game that runs 10 frames slower per second. That's awful. Now again, in some instances that is actually legit, but almost all the time it's not actually a thing. And most of the consoles, if you play the imports, will just compensate for that. And even a lot of them have modes where they're like, oh, do you want to just run it in 60 hertz instead? So even that doesn't really hold any water. Now, the one argument to me that actually makes a lot of sense, but no one has ever made it to me, is the financial side of things. Now, here's the thing. When you are in North America, it makes all the sense in the world that the games you get would come from your own region. That's going to be the most financially viable, usually. And if you want imports, particularly with certain consoles, like, say, the Sega Saturn, a lot of people focus on Japan because the games are just so much cheaper there. Again, that's a financial reason. And in Europe, that's really not the case. European stuff is expensive. It's expensive when you're there, much less having to import it on top of all of that, or at least go through that type of effort. Now, I've been lucky enough to be able to go to Europe multiple times, different parts of Europe, so I've been able to amass a nice PAL collection over the years. But even then, like, I've never really had to spend all that much money. It's one of those things where it just seems like a lot more expensive online than it is in person. But again, most people are going to import stuff online, so I get that. But again, no one has ever made that case to me. And so the other two cases I've ever heard about this is there's an aesthetic argument. Now, a lot of games, like if you look at modern case artwork for, say, an Xbox One game or a PS4 game or PS5, what have you, you'll notice on an American copy, it has the rating, which is usually like E for everyone, T for teen, M for mature, or whatever. But in Europe, they have like multiple rating systems because it's not a singular country, obviously, nor is it even a singular union since the EU is consisted of, well, we're not going to go into that, but it's consisted of different political bodies. And so as a result, you have different rating systems on the box. Typically, most of Europe seems to use the PEGI system, and particularly the UK uses that. But again, mainland Europe does as well, except for like Germany and Austria, where they have a totally different system called like the USK system. And the reason I bring any of that up is that you have these giant things usually on the box, and I've seen people just complain that they just don't like the artwork because it's so bogged down by a lot of that imagery. But in most cases, and I mean that literally because these are plastic cases, most of them don't have all of those. Like this one does, but that's like about it. So for the most part, it's not really a thing. And another one of the factors I've heard people mention is, I think this is just straight ignorance in a lot of cases, and that's kind of what's going to lead us into this a little bit, is that a lot of the time the assumption is the games that came out in North America are also the games that came out in Europe. It's just Japan that gets weird or different stuff. Europe never gets anything. So people will be like vaguely aware that occasionally Europe will get like a localized sports game or something based on an IP that's totally non-existent here, like Asterisk and Obelix or whatever. But nobody really cares about that. There's never really a consideration. There might actually be some decent, cool games over there that might be worth checking out. So that's what I want to do today, is show you some PAL exclusives that might just be worth your time. And also, again, to pose that same question to you. If you were in the US and Canada, what has been your primary reason for never importing stuff? And again, you could be that person who's like, I just don't import stuff at all. That's fine. What genuinely boggles my mind is when people say, I collect stuff in my region, I also will import stuff from Japan, but I just stay away from PAL stuff. I've seen that so many times. Like, again, at conventions when I've asked, like, do you have any European stuff? Even after they've got North American and Japanese stuff, like, that shouldn't be weird. But it is. Like, the response is generally laughter. Like, I'm just missing something. And it's like, I'm almost actually asking you guys, like, what is it I'm missing? So while you guys think about that, let's take a look at some various PAL exclusives. Now, I would be hard-pressed if I didn't acknowledge that if you're the kind of collector like me who has gotten to a point where you've kind of amassed a lot of the stuff in your region, now you're just looking for weirder things, it's kind of fun to get into collecting oddball consoles. And then with oddball consoles comes various oddball games. Now, one of the videos I've done in the past is on the Amiga CD32. I've covered it a couple of times. Now, technically, this console did come out in Canada, so it's not really exclusive to Europe, but it essentially is because the Canadian version is so uncommon. But yes, I got one of those consoles from the UK, and every time I've been to the UK, I look for copies of games for it. I've never seen any outside of the UK, although I was told parts of Scandinavia should have them. But I mean, I was in Sweden, I never saw any. But anyway, so like an example of an Amiga CD32 game. You know, this is Overkill and Lunar Sea. I'm not going to sit here and say, like, this is why you need to import PAL stuff. But it's just a point of, like, if you're willing to open your mind to some stuff outside your nostalgia comfort zone of Nintendo and Sega and whatever, there's like entire other histories of consoles and platforms and games out there that are kind of cool to check out just for the fun of it. Not just the games, but the collecting aspect if you're into that. So, I mean, you know, that's cool. But again, you want more information on that console, you can check it out. But, I mean, to get into other things that aren't just exclusive or basically exclusive consoles, you can get into somewhat failed consoles, but I have to acknowledge this, otherwise all the Europeans would get upset. Of course, the Philips CDI, which was the last console ever actually made by a European company. It was kind of funny. I was looking at my CDI games, and I got most of them in Europe because they're much, much cheaper over there because they're much more common. But I was going to just grab like Zelda's Adventure because I have the entirety of the Zelda Unholy Triforce. But it occurred to me that of 2 of the 3 that I own, including Zelda's Adventure, were actually the American versions. I was surprised by that. So the only one I had that was actually the PAL version is this. This is a Wand of Gamelon. So the box art is a different style. The case is different. Most of the game, at least the American ones, were like normal jewel cases. Now, I've seen other European releases that were normal jewel cases. So in this case, it was just a bizarre decision. But yes, so yeah, Zelda games. Again, this is not really me saying like, this is why you need to own PAL stuff. No, these are just some oddball ones. And I'm now going to show you the one Australian game I picked up, because Australia is always forgotten about. Australia is a major country, doesn't have a huge population, obviously, but it's a PAL territory, just in like the wrong part of the world. And it doesn't usually get many exclusive games or anything. This one it got. And this one, I remember picking this up after this platform was discontinued. Nobody cared about this. I only wanted it because I was like, yeah, you know, these games are so cheap and it'd be cool to get every game for that console, whatever, so I'll just go ahead and pick this up. So I bought it. It was $3. It was brand new. Opened it, tried to put it away, and that was pretty much the end of it. It wasn't until recently I learned that this game is like ludicrously expensive. Sega Rally for the Nokia N-Gage. There was an exclusive Sega Rally game in Australia for the N-Gage. This game is insanely expensive now. I had no idea that would ever be the case, I admit. But isn't that, it's just kind of emblematic of like, you know, don't necessarily judge like, hey, man, that's a PAL game, I don't want that. Like, why not? Sega made it. It's for a platform I already like. So I was like, why not? It's cheap, I'll pick it up. And now apparently it's like this huge financial investment I had never intended on, but there it is. So that's another reason I don't totally get why people just avoid the PAL stuff, because that stuff is valuable too. You just have to kind of know what to navigate. Just use your normal video game retro senses and just kind of apply them to another region. Honestly, it's a lot of fun because it's like a whole new world of stuff to check out that you weren't familiar with, yet they're games that you should know because they exist on platforms you were generally familiar with. But okay, you're like, these are not great examples. I'm never going to have a CD32. I'm never going to have a CDI. I'm never going to have an N-Gage. I am tuning out. Well, don't do it just yet. I'm going to start putting up some familiar. We got the Nintendo shirt on, so let's focus on Nintendo stuff. These are all games for Nintendo platforms that you probably own or have owned, but games you didn't necessarily have access to if you were in North America. First up is an NES game. This is New Ghostbusters 2. Now you might be like, dude, I had Ghostbusters 2 on NES. I'm about to unsub. Don't unsub just yet. You had Ghostbusters 2 for the NES. This is not that game. This is a completely different game that was, honestly, like it says, New Ghostbusters 2. This was actually made by HAL Laboratories. This was made by the guys who would go on to make Smash Brothers. Okay, this was like a legit Nintendo effort to make a Ghostbusters game. Generally regarded as one of the best Ghostbusters games ever made, and it was exclusive to Europe on the NES. Now, eventually fans would take this game and, you know, bring it over here and put it on, like, you know, reproduction cartridges and all that, but the official release was Europe only. And another cool thing about this is that the only thing stopping you from playing this on a North American NES is just the 10NES lockout chip, which you should disable anyway. If you have something like a retro AVS, this will work right on it. And actually, all the ones we've mentioned so far, all region free. We haven't run into that problem yet, have we? Pretty interesting. So anyway, that's a cool example. Now this one is actually a legit one where you would not really ever want to import this one just because of the logistics. The N64 admittedly did not get a whole lot of PAL territory love. In fact, there was only 7 games released in Europe for the N64 that North America never got. And of those 7, 3 of them were released in Japan. So the only advantage they had in Europe is that the games were in English. And I can't believe I didn't mention that until this moment. That's another thing that blows my mind about, you know, because sometimes you'll get a game that comes out in Europe and it comes out in Japan, but it doesn't come out here. And people will still import the Japanese version. I sit there like, the European version, with almost very few exceptions, will be in English. Like, what are you doing? You live in the US or Canada. Chances are you speak English. And there's this continent right over there that has the game you want in the language you speak, and you went the other direction. Always blows my mind. But this is not one of those examples. This is one of the 4 games that actually was exclusive to the N64 in Europe. It's the best of the 4, but still not that necessarily great. This is Taz Express. This actually had a sequel on the GameCube, the PS2, and the Xbox, but the first game was only on the N64 and only in Europe. Now, the only reason this isn't that great of an example, because it's a perfectly fine game, is that this is a legit case where you cannot import this. They actually designed a chip specifically for this game, oddly enough, that completely locks it out from working at any sort of import device or any sort of like region-free console on the N64. This was actually so irritating that when a guy was like trying to hook me up with a completely region-modded N64, and he was in the UK, he was like doing everything he could, like every backdoor he could think of to try and make it work. He never got it. And at this time, N64s in Europe were super cheap. So he just like, I give up. And he just threw an N64 in the box. He's like, they're like £5. I don't even care. Now you have an N64 that can play that game. So this is an example of something neat that you actually cannot play most of the time. Although EverDrive seemed to support this game now. But that even then was a recent addition. But this one right here is a perfect example of what I was just talking about with language differences. So this is for the Nintendo GameCube, the Doshin the Giant. This is a Nintendo-made game, originally for the N64 DD in Japan. It even had a sequel on the 64 DD. But they eventually did a complete upgrade of the game, redid it, released it in Japan for the GameCube, and in Europe for the GameCube. Now, in Europe, the game was completely translated into English. It was never released in North America. It's a God simulator made by Nintendo. Why wouldn't you want this? Now, the GameCube is not a region-free console, but it's very easy to get around its region coding. In fact, Action Replay as a boot disk can do it, and now, in 2021, we have tons of different methods by which to get around stuff like that. One of the arguments I hear against stuff like this is usually there's the resolution difference. People aren't totally familiar with how that works. Like this outputs at 576i. Is my TV going to support that? Whatever. The thing is, a lot of the time, historically, you're right. Your TV probably would not have supported it. But now, TVs have become a lot more uniform throughout the world, the high-def era. Like my TV has no reason to support 576i or 576p, but it does, because it's essentially just a digital like upgrade at this point. So it's like, yeah, whatever, it supports it. So I'll bet you your TV now would support even the stock resolution of this game. But even if you wanted to go on to the next level and take like, I did a video on this actually, the GameCube with a GC loader and an HDMI mod and all that sort of stuff, you can force it to run at resolutions you like, you know, and then you never truly will ever run into this problem, and it'll look fantastic. I just do not see why people don't import stuff like this. This one I can understand why you wouldn't import, but I think culturally speaking, it's interesting. This is for the Nintendo Wii. This is a game called We Dare, Flirty Fun for All. Now, I'm not going to level with you completely. This is not a good game. But this is a PAL exclusive. I don't have many PAL exclusives for the Wii. But this one even says on the back that it supports both 50 hertz and 60 hertz. So at that point, all you need is a region-free Wii, which is, I mean, if you own a Wii and you're watching this channel, odds are your Wii is hacked and it's region-free, or a hacked Wii U, whatever. Then you can play this. Now, this is one of those examples of cultural differences that I find kind of fascinating. It's no secret that in North America, we are a lot more prude than our European brothers and sisters. And so as a result, a game like this would just, socially speaking, never be released. This is like a party game that's literally like, has a lot of sexual overtones to it. So this, culturally speaking, they would never even have entertained the notion of releasing this here, even though it's honestly very benign. So that's the kind of stuff you open yourself up to, is like, this is all like a whole extra culture that speaks the same language as me and has a bunch of totally different games I've never checked out. And in a lot of cases, they're not even that expensive, and the process of trying to play them is not that hard. Again, I remind you, most of the time, if you want to import something from Japan, you're essentially going through the exact same series of checks that you have to get rid of there. There's very few, like, things you don't have to deal with. I mean, yes, Japan uses NTSC, but as we just said, like, for the most part, that's not even a problem anymore. So, I don't know, I think check stuff like that out. Not that that particular game is actually great, but this one is. If you had a Wii U, one of the best exclusives for Europe, Project Zero, Maiden of Blackwater. This is Fatal Frame 5. You know, this is the physical edition. We did get a digital version of this, I don't deny that, but physically, if you're into collecting, and you probably are if you're watching this, this had a physical edition in Europe that came with, I have the whole collector's set that comes with all these extra things. It's really cool. And again, a simple region-free mod on the Wii U, and boom, this game runs. This is at the point where, you know, frequencies and resolutions don't even matter anymore. This is like running, you know, 1080p at 60 frames per second, or you know, 60, maybe it's 30. But either way, it works. My point is it would work. At that point, all you're dealing with is region coding. That's all you're dealing with, and that's actually very easily bypassed. So why not? Now, this is an example of why I see people hating on the artwork, because those 18s are huge and ugly. I agree with you on that. But anyway, the next one up, I'm just going to show you, even though it's not that great. I just have it, so why not? An example of a Nintendo 3DS game. I didn't even open this. This is just a bizarre one, because this is the 3DS was region locked, but this particular cartridge is not. So it's not a great example. But the only reason I have it is this was a game that was exclusive to the Louvre in Paris. You know, like where the Mona Lisa and stuff is. Like, you buy this there, it's literally an interactive guide that you can use to just kind of wander around the museum. So I just got it for collector's purposes. This is just an oddball. This isn't really greatly representative of the whole thing. But still, I thought it'd be kind of cool to talk about that for a second. Now, you're like, not so much Nintendo. Maybe you're more of a Sega guy. Historically, I always was. So let's talk a little bit about Sega's history over there. So the console that Americans tend to associate Sega with the most is the Sega Genesis, aka the Mega Drive. But we often forget that there was a system that was released here prior to that called the Sega Master System. And the reason we tend to forget it is the Sega Master System was a complete dud here. They did just about everything wrong with it, even though it was actually a pretty cool platform. But in Europe, the platform was ridiculously successful. It actually outperformed the NES by quite a lot. So as a result, there's a ton of games that came out in Europe that we never got. So a lot of the time, if I'm over there, particularly in the UK, I'll be like, you know what? These games are super cheap. I'm never going to see these. We never got them. Let's just grab a few. So here's an example. And look at this box art. Aladdin for the Sega Master System. Look how alive this is. This actually looks like the Genesis version where it's like crazy artwork. Ours were terrible. They were usually just that grid and there was like a single little picture in the corner and you're like, what even is this? It looks like the worst thing ever. But theirs look like real games. And you have all these platforming games and all sorts of great stuff, some of which we would get on the Game Gear, but for the most part, a lot of your favorite Game Gear games had cartridge physical editions on the Sega Master System in Europe. And another one that's region-free. And if you play this on a North American Master System, it runs in 60 hertz. Why wouldn't you do it? But okay. Next up, the Sega Genesis, aka the Sega Mega Drive. Now, obviously this console was ridiculously huge here, but there were a whole bunch of games in Europe I was surprised to find out never came here. Even ones based on IPs that you're probably very familiar with. This one I bought in Blackpool, actually. This is Captain Planet and the Planeteers. You guys remember that show? They had a platforming game for the Mega Drive Genesis that only existed in Europe. I remember when I saw it there, I was like, how have I never seen that before? How is that possible? And so I went ahead and I looked and I was like, dude, yes, it only came out in Europe. The Mega Drive was a success there. So as a result, there was a whole lot of regional stuff, IPs you'd probably be familiar with, and some good games. I'm not going to say it's like the greatest game ever made or anything, but it's cool to know that there were like legit games over there. And again, not expensive, region-free for the most part, the Genesis and Mega Drive stuff was. So it's like, why? Why not do it? Now, this one is a great example of never importing stuff, but I just want to throw it out there anyway. The Sega 32X. It only had 2 exclusives in Europe. Darkside, which is a ludicrously expensive game. I own a reproduction of it because I'm never going to own the original. And the one I do have is FIFA Soccer 96. Okay, yes, this is not a game worth playing. This is not something worth importing. It's only worth having for collector's reasons because it's a physical edition of a 32X game that only Europe got. But this is a great example of bad. Like, this is region locked, and it's locked at 50 hertz as well. This is totally a worthless coaster over here. I just wanted to show it to you guys just so I could say that I did. So yeah, that's a good example of not to do it. Next up, though, the Sega Saturn. Sega Saturn is totally underappreciated when it comes to the European import stuff. So the one I'm going to show you here is Deep Fear. Now, Deep Fear, I've mentioned on this channel before. Deep Fear is a Resident Evil clone made by Sega exclusively for the Saturn. It came out in Japan, and it obviously came out in Europe because I'm sitting here holding it. And this version is in full English and everything. Now, here's the thing. I know people will point this out. There was an American version of this game scheduled. It was ultimately canceled, but the ISOs were dumped online, so you can check out the American version if you want to. However, if you want to own the original and have like all the artwork and all that stuff, it exists, and you can own it and you can play it. And again, it runs just fine. You know, I mean, again, you have to have the same basic import system like a memory, like an action replay or whatever, but just like you would for Japanese stuff. But there you go. The whole game's in English. And another great Sega-based horror game that we never got for the Dreamcast is Evil Twin. This game's by Ubisoft. Now, this came out here on the PlayStation 2, but the Dreamcast version is the far superior version, and it came out in Europe only. This didn't even get a Japanese release. This game's expensive as hell now, I admit, but at the time it wasn't. But it's just another one of these cool examples of, like, why don't more people want this? You know what I mean? It's just strange to me. But moving on, it's not even just our retro guys, our classic Nintendos and Segas and so on. It's even the modern dudes are doing this. So, like, Microsoft has done this. One example here, the original Xbox. This is not the best PAL exclusive N60 or Xbox game, but it's one I wanted to point out because Panzer Elite Action: Fields of Glory, Microsoft, for whatever reason, actually made this game backwards compatible with the Xbox One and Series X. They sold it digitally here. That was the only way you could get it, unless you actually imported the disc. This will work on an Xbox One X or an Xbox Series X and run in 4K. I don't know why Microsoft chose it, but it will. And it just shows that there is some life in that and that you could see more of those PAL exclusives over here. But the Xbox is another one where I'm just like, why wouldn't you do it? Almost everybody mods an Xbox, right? So the region coding thing just poof, gone. So then you have to deal with what's the resolution thing. I bet all the PAL games are locked at 480i because PAL Xboxes are locked at 480i. No, most of the games actually support 480p natively, or even some of them support 720p. And in a handful of cases, there's patches if you need that. But most of them support the high resolution modes, even though the hardware they were built on doesn't. So it's actually better to import them. Again, and there's a whole bunch of them. It's just kind of crazy. This one this led to why I even have a modded 360. This is a game called Iron Sky Invasion. Now, I knew nothing about this other than it was an exclusive when I picked it up. This was like some weird TV show that Europe got about like Nazis on the moon or something like that. But the game itself is unfortunately region locked, which is kind of a 50-50 split with the 360. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But Mr. Mario actually hooked me up with a modded Xbox 360 just so I could, you know, get this game to run. So yes, there are certain times, sometimes you have to take other steps, but after you get past the region coding, in this case, the resolution's no longer an issue. You know, frame rate's not an issue, so why not? And there aren't a ton of PAL exclusive 360 games, but you know, they do exist. But even if you're like, no, man, I'm more of a PlayStation guy. Well, don't worry, I got you covered. We have, if you like your Resident Evils and your horror games, I got this recommendation from Radical Reggie, my buddy. He recommended Chaos Break. This is another Resident Evil clone for the PS1. I think this came out in Japan, but again, it did come out in Europe. And it's, again, full English, fully playable. All you have to do is be able to get beyond the PS1's region coding abilities, which is not that hard these days. And then there you go. You have an entirely like new Resident Evil type of experience. I picked that up in Play Expo Blackpool, actually. Very cool. I got a good deal on it because doesn't matter. But anyway, the next game up is another one of these. I saw this in the UK on a store shelf in 2014. And the second I saw it, I picked it up just because I knew it was an exclusive just by looking at it. Because culturally, this game would never have come out in the United States. And that's Seven Sins for the PS2. This is like a Sims game with sexual overtones. Like massive sexual overtones. And like, so my girlfriend played this. She's huge into The Sims. And she was like, this is the greatest thing ever. She just absolutely loved it. And it's just like, this game used to be super cheap. I think people have kind of found out about this one because now it's kind of an expensive game. Well, it's expensive online. I was able to find yet another copy of this only a couple of years ago, I think in Belgium, for like €3. But online, it's like ridiculously expensive still. So whatever, that's a cool one to check out if you're into The Sims. And then finally, this is actually the game that kind of inspired me to actually go ahead with this whole video. Like I said, I've kind of been thinking about this for years, wanting to defend PAL stuff. But this particular one was showing up in my news feed. So I decided, okay, it's time to make a video about this. I picked up years ago when I went to the UK, I had a very specific list of exclusives I wanted. And this one was up there because I figured one day this would be valuable, and I was totally right because of recent events. As you probably know, Sony is shutting down a lot of the digital services for the PlayStation 3, the PlayStation Portable, and the PlayStation Vita. So there was a PlayStation 3 digital exclusive game that did get a physical edition, but in Europe only. And it is Ratchet & Clank Quest for Booty. This game is now super valuable online, and I'm just like, I told you, like for years, like I just don't understand why people don't pay more attention to the European gaming options, because they often get a lot of physical editions that we just don't get over here for various different reasons. I mean, it's not just stuff like this where it's a physical edition of a game we got digitally, but it's also like entire games that we never get for social reasons, or just, you know, who knows what reasons why we don't get certain games, but we don't. I hadn't even thought of this until people in my Discord pointed it out, but one other benefit that comes up is actually that there are some games, like this Terminator game. The American version of this game is like ludicrously expensive, whereas the European version is super cheap. And the only difference between the two is the rating system being 16 PEGI instead of, you know, T for teen or M for mature or whatever it was over here. Yet the savings is huge. So that's actually a thing that happens a lot, especially with the last couple of generations, and the games are region free too. So if you find a game over in the US or Canada that's like super expensive, maybe look at the PAL version. It's not even really PAL anymore, it's just the European version, and it might actually be financially worth getting. The point of this video is basically to not only ask the question about, you know, why is it that more people in North America do not pursue European exclusives, yet are willing, in a lot of cases, to get Japanese exclusives. But at the same time, while asking that, I also wanted to say, kind of enlighten and say, look, it's not all just like random sports games for, you know, like soccer or whatever you're probably thinking. It's not always this horribly region-locked platform. I mean, again, PS3, this game's region-free. It always was. Like, this was, you could have got this at any time, region-free, no problem. It really didn't matter. So obviously that's not going to work in every case, as I kind of broke down there. You know, sometimes like the PS2 is not a very import-friendly console, but at this point in time, I'm betting you know how to get around it. In some cases, yes, you have to take those steps, but I'll put it out there that those same steps would apply from Japan. If they apply for Europe, they apply for Japan in most instances. So really, with the exception of like the Taz game, why not check it out? So again, financially though, I'll grant you that one. But if you ever get a chance to go over there to parts of Europe, try to pick up games there. The place I recommend the most in all of Europe that I've ever found for cheap video games, or at least a good selection of retro video games, is actually in Paris, France. There's an entire district called Republique. It's like a street of retro game stores. It's insane. And France in particular actually has a lot of games exclusive to just France. Not even all of Europe, just France. So that can be an interesting thing in of itself. But there you go, guys. I hope that was somewhat informative. I invite you to try and check out some of these, maybe look up some gameplay online. I'm sure you'll find things about these you think are neat. One other thing I want to point out, by the way, everybody, is I now have a merch store. So I'll put a link to that in the description as well. If you want to buy a t-shirt or a mug or any of that sort of stuff, it's now an option. If you guys could please like, comment, subscribe, I appreciate that as well. Check out the social media stuff in the description: Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, whatever. Hit the join button and all that sort of stuff. Always great. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all later.